Hey everyone, this is Louis7 and today I have a starter build for the Redline Guardian for y'all. This is a new series that I am planning on doing for most classes and specs, especially as a gap filler between my more in-depth guides, so any feedback you all have on this is appreciated. But basically we'll be going over a starter 50 trait point build and also briefly going over the virtue traits. The goal of this video is to be a little bit quicker than some of my old, more in-depth trait analyses, and it's going to be something that's again more starter oriented. So while you can see my final build here in the video, we're going to respec and only go to 50 trait points. So with the Redline Guardian, this one's of course just focused on damage and making us quest faster, really level faster. So to start off, we'll get a couple skills. The first one's going to be one that forces open our parry response skills, so we can do that without actually having to parry an enemy. This is going to be a very important ability moving forward. And we actually get an ability Overwhelm, which is going to be a part of the parry chain. So the first part of the parry chain is the retaliation or whirling retaliation. Both of those would be the first part. And then the second part would actually be Overwhelm. We'll get some more things for the second part. And even there is a third part when we get more into the build. So of course the big thing with the Guardian is going to be the parry response chain, bleeds, and also just big hits is their main themes really. So starting off, we actually have one of the least useful traits because 0.5% of your max morale for one trait point is very bad, and you have to actually get a critical hit with our parry response skill. That's a very hard requirement, or at least it's going to be something that comes up rarely and basically does nothing for your actual health. Even 2.5% ain't that good. So we'll skip that one. Parry chance can be good, but we'd rather focus on something offensive. So naturally we go to just raw skill damage here, getting that up to 10% and 5 trait points. Again, I would love your all's feedback on the flow of this video and how in-depth or quick I go over things, but I will point out the set bonuses I plan to save for the end, so we'll just get all the trait points at once for the 50 trait point build, and then look at the set bonuses afterwards so we're not interrupted. But moving on, we have 2 traits in this row, and we'll first get Thrust because that is an active skill and it's a part of the parry chain, so we can go ahead and get that one. But Broad Strokes is also a very fantastic choice because it gives Sweeping Cut a bleed, and we love bleeds as a Redline Guardian. It also increases the number of targets it hits. Finally, to just fill out some more points, we'll put 2 more in parry chance, and that will unlock the next row. So moving on here, we have the next row, and this is going to be one of our main abilities, but oddly enough, we actually don't want to use it that frequently. That might seem silly because Brutal Assault seems like an exciting ability. In fact, I'll put a trait point in it because we'll want it, and I will go ahead and apply that. But the reason we don't want to use it that frequently, I will anchor it maybe like right here, is if we look at some other abilities, something like Sting, sure, it does less damage, but it's significantly quicker. The animation for Brutal Assault is very long, and you have much higher priority abilities, like Sweeping Cut would do more damage overall, Vexing Blow hits in AoE, Force Opening will open your parry response and it does more damage anyway. Force Opening is going to be one of our higher priority abilities, as well as Sting, just because it's so quick. And even in our parry response, all those skills are more valuable than Brutal Assault at the moment. Put a point in that one, but we'll look at the rightmost one, which is critical hits with your parry response skills restore power. Again, this one's that is just not going to be that useful overall. Typically with Guardian, if you have one piece of in-combat power regen gear or one piece of fate gear, you should be set on power, especially if you use potions, so we don't need to worry about that. And we'll get 4 points in Tireless Blow. I guess we should actually read what that does. And this one can allow us to reset the cooldown of Brutal Assault when we use a parry response skill. This is pretty much better than anything previous in the trees, but it's not the most exciting, so we'll only put 4 points into it now because that will unlock the next row. So with the next row, we can do Deeper Wounds. By the way, something I forgot to mention at this point is Thrust. The bleed on that is called Deep Wound. So Overwhelm turns the Deep Wound into a Terrible Wound. Yes, it is true that Thrust and Overwhelm are in the same part of the parry response chain, so you can only use one or the other. It's a little bit awkward with that, so you have to go through the parry response twice, once using Thrust, once using Overwhelm. It takes a long time and something you probably won't want to do so much in regular combat. In regular combat, fighting just regular enemies, it's probably better to just use Overwhelm when you can, because that just does so much more damage than Thrust. Only in long fights it's really worth using Thrust, or if you hit a high health enemy like a signature. while fighting other mobs, it can be worth using thrust, but typically if fights last longer, that's when you want to use thrust, otherwise just overwhelm. Anyway, moving on, the whole point with this was that deeper wounds impacts the bleed on both of those. So this is more appealing than the previous traits, but we also have To the King here, which is going to be the capstone ability in our parry response chains To the King. So we'll put points in that one first. And Deeper Wounds, of course, is going to be of interest because we get more bleed pulses for Deep Wound and Terrible Wound from Thrust. And we get more damage for the wounds there. So 4 points in that, and we unlock the next row, and this is when we can get Hemorrhage to make Brutal Assault have a bleed at the end. This will be with 5 points. It'll have 100% chance, so that will guarantee your bleed. To the Rescue is one that is not too valuable overall. So we'll go ahead and skip out on that one for now, mainly because the cooldown, even when you get the set bonus for a Brutal Charge that'll make it increase your damage, it's still not going to be all that effective overall in the long run. So we'll just put 5 points into Hemorrhage. That's much more value. And once you have that, I know it's a little bit of a long way there, but it just feels so wonderful when you actually have the guaranteed bleed from Brutal Assault. So at this point, you will have that guaranteed bleed. So in this next row, we have a couple interesting choices. One here is Warrior's Fortitude, which actually sounds pretty exciting. It's going to give a little bit of a boost to our defensive cooldown ability that just restores us a bunch of morale. It has a 20-second duration and 2-minute cooldown, so not that much uptime with it, but what we can get from that is increased physical mastery. It's honestly not all that much physical mastery. The main thing is actually going to be the 2% crit chance that it gives, and you also get a little bit of a defensive boost, but that's not too impactful. So this is a trait that just because it doesn't have much uptime with the cooldown ability, and it's a defensive cooldown, you want to use it in defensive situations, not for offensive situations typically. So it's something we're probably going to pass on for now, but is notable as something that, yeah, we could probably spend trait points in that later. As a little bit of a check, we're only at 26 trait points spent right now, just to keep that in mind. But we can look at the next one, which eventually will give us a 100% chance for To the King, our capstone ability in the parry response chain now. We'll have a 100% chance to increase your melee damage by 10% and attack speed by 20%. So that is a great benefit for To the King. Also, just getting a point in that will allow To the King to trigger a parry response itself, so you can just start off on the parry chain altogether again. So I was messing around testing things. You may have seen that Warrior's Fortitude, I went ahead and actually tested that out just to double check things with this video. I accidentally put an extra point in Deeper Wounds. We did not want that yet. It didn't really impact what I went over earlier, but I did just want to point that out if things look different. We'll put 5 full points in Blind Rage, and that will unlock the final row, and we can get Hammer Down as the biggest skill of interest there. 40-second cooldown and does absolutely massive damage, and can even stun enemies if they have low health. So that's something we're going to definitely want, and honestly want to use that on cooldown to effectively one-shot enemies typically. And at this point, we can go ahead and backfill. The only thing really worth backfilling is Deeper Wounds. The reason I don't put 1 trait point, it's only 1 trait point, but I don't put 1 trait point in Tireless Blows because it's just 10% extra chance to reset the cooldown of Brutal Assault, and that's still one of our lower priority abilities. While Brutal Assault can now trigger a bleed with our Hemorrhage trait, that's still something that's not really worth the 1 trait point unless you just happen to have 1 extra trait point for your character, but we will not be applying that for our starter build here, at least yet. So after finishing out the red line, the main area for a red line guardian to go is really the yellow line. The blue line honestly doesn't offer too much for us. There's a little bit of defensive boost stuff, but we shouldn't really need that. So having said that, you probably saw that my build went into the yellow line. So now our traits will cost 2 trait points in the yellow line, but we can go ahead and basically fill out standard traits in the yellow line until we get down to 50 trait points spent. I also will point out these top 2 on the left here are actually going to have 0 impact on us as a red line guardian, so we don't really care about those. What we do care about, however, is War Chant as another nice AoE, especially a long range AoE, and it has a little debuff with it. We can also get Numbered Senses, numbed senses that is, and that will be our final 50 trait point build. So with spending spending a point in Tireless Blows that would have ruined our final 50 trait point build, but Numb Senses is really nice because Ignore Pain will now remove 4 debuffs at once, which is just very helpful. There is actually one more note I realized I completely forgot to talk about Honorable Combat. That is a trait that can sometimes provide you a somewhat valuable heal, but in my experience it's not really worth the trait point, especially if we consider that would have us remove Numb Senses, even though we could take a point from Numb Senses and get Honorable Combat if you really feel like you need that healing boost, because you can also put the extra leftover point from Numb Senses into Warrior's Fortitude, so that is an option to look out for if you're interested in that. Again, with trait points being flexible, I don't necessarily just recommend following even my builds blindly and thinking about what you need for your character and in these situations, but this is what I have for the starter build. Alright, let's go ahead and cover the set bonuses here before we move on to virtue traits. The first one just gives us increased melee damage and crit damage multiplier, pretty simple. The second one will give us a little bit of a reflect when we parry enemies, so we will do some damage by preventing ourselves from taking damage. The third one is actually going to be an active skill, but you will have to have an ally nearby you. So this is a buff that you can put on an ally that is near you, and it's great as a DPS Guardian, especially in group content if you are with a tank who you will want to put this on, because if the tank will parry an attack, then the Guardian protecting you, which is you, the one that's casting protection by the sword, you will get the buff to open your parry response chain, and this will buff nearby allies within 10 meters, so it's a pretty short range, but it will give them plus 5% melee damage. So in the times that you are a DPS Guardian running group content or just playing with anybody else, it's a valuable buff to remember to put up. Fourth set bonus here is going to be that Guardian Bleeds have extended duration, so they will last longer essentially. And then up fifth here is going to be Brutal Charge, which I hinted at earlier and I think we looked at. This increases charge duration, but it will also make it have a melee damage buff for you. That melee damage buff is 10% melee damage, and the other effect it will grant you is the first target you attack will be knocked down for 5 seconds. An interesting strategy with Brutal Charge is going to be using an AoE. If you use an AoE after Brutal Charge, every single enemy that gets hit will actually be knocked down with a stun for 5 seconds. That can actually be very valuable. Anyway, moving on, we get a really boring set bonus and even more melee damage. This is actually worse than the first one, but it also gives us more crit damage multiplier again. Wow, they really can't think of much for the Guardian. Anyway, moving on to the very last one is critical hits against an opponent with slashing wound will inflict additional damage. If you have no idea what slashing wound is, I don't blame you, but that is the one from Sweeping Cut. And now we can look at the virtue traits here. So with virtue traits, as a DPS Guardian, I recommend basically what I would recommend for every DPS character, which is actually slightly different than what I have, because I had mine built defensively as a tank, even though I don't tank that much. That is just what I happen to build on this character for leveling virtues, so it looks a bit off here. Still, I recommend number 1 virtue is going to be loyalty. Number 2 virtue that's typically all around good to have is wit, but I will point out that valor over here can actually be a little bit better in terms of the stats it gives you. So if you want to level that one up second instead of loyalty, that is a perfectly fine option. But I did want to point out that wit is more all around, and the finesse can be very valuable to have, especially at lower levels. So I tend to level up wit before valor, but valor gives us overall more benefit in the stats that it offers. Moving on from there, we have to get 2 more virtues, and I recommend confidence and zeal would be the 2 other DPS ones. This is the standard DPS package that I would run on my characters, but as usual, and as I cover in my virtue trait guide, there are some other options you could consider, like fidelity would be the next choice if you want a defensive boost with its tactical mitigation and vitality. You could run that instead of something like zeal would be the least efficient one, just because main stats are not that efficient, but at that point it really depends on what stats your character needs. Again, you can find out more in both my stats guide and my virtue guide on how all those work together, because of course virtues are related to the stats as they give 3 stats and even have the passive bonuses. And now that we are finished with the class trait build and the virtue trait build, I do want to mention that I usually have a brief gameplay section at the end of these types of guides, but to keep this one short and focused on just the starter build, I am electing to skip that for this video. If you're interested in some Redline Guardian gameplay, I will link more resources below. But again, please do give me feedback on that, as well as I am looking for feedback, especially on the flow of how the class traits went and the virtue traits. As promised, I'm going to go into a little bit more details on the series and the context behind it, especially if you all have feedback on it. So as you saw, this was really a starter build with only 50 trait points spent. This was something that would be a great opportunity for me to have kind of like a gap filler type guide videos between my bigger class guides. In the leveling guide series that I am doing now for all the classes, I have Warden and currently Minstrel in the work. But this is also especially great for a class that I perhaps don't play as much and I have more experience on them lower levels, where my experience with really high trait point numbers is more limited in scope, especially to whatever you have at level 120 now, and to what I have been able to do on Bull, when you can actually boost your character up. So I really think this series is also a great opportunity to get to some of those less touched classes in my channel. So especially if you want to request a class that I perhaps don't cover all that much, this would be a great opportunity to do that as well, thought I'd mention. And yeah, I hope to keep this going, but really a lot of that weighs on your all's feedback and how well the series is received. And then one more thing you may be wondering is, why 50 trait points? It seems like all my starter builds just happen to be 50 trait points. Is it because it's a nice round number? Well, not necessarily. It just seems to be a good number of trait points to finish off the primary spec, the traits in the primary spec that you go into. So like for the Redline Guardian here, we got through all of the Redline traits that we wanted and were able to dive a little bit into the Yellow line, but the Guardian is a bit unique because they don't have that many great traits to begin with, actually. So with it being around when you end the primary specialization for your character, putting traits in that, and being a nice round number, both of those just happen to work well together. But if you have feedback on that number, please do let me know as well. Anyway, enough rambling about this, and that will be it. So I hope you all enjoyed this video and learned something useful. And if you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content, where you will get early access to guides just like this one. And thanks for watching, everyone.